The terrible civil war that convulsed Spain between 1936 and 1939 was particularly hard on women, who became victims, heads of families, or protagonists in the fight. Transformed into heroines of the front lines or the rear guard, they played a definitive role in this historical conflict. With the profound social changes it wrought, the Civil War unquestionably rendered the collective work of women visible for the first time in the history of Spain. Convened for the first time by political parties and unions and grouped in the main Republican women's associations, such as the Association of Anti-Fascist Women, the Free Women, and the Young Women's Union, women emerged from their political isolation and participated enthusiastically in the struggle against undemocratic forces. Natural leaders such as Dolores Ibarruri Gómez, La Pasionaria, and Federica Montseny shone in this climate of recognition and optimism, as did the image of the militia woman, which frequently appeared as a role model in anarchist, communist, and socialist republican propaganda in the first months of the war. Warlike women such as Rosario the Dynamiter, the subject of a poem by Miguel Hernández, and who ended up in the Ventas prison, and women who were portrayed in blue overalls, carrying a rifle and marching to the front. However, according to historian Mary Nash, these women were a minority because the militia woman did not represent a new and authentic female prototype, but simply a symbol of war and revolution. Indeed, the motto of the time was men to the front, women to the rear guard. This gender differentiation of women's work during the war can be seen in the chronicles of the time, which described it thus: women teachers peeled potatoes, nurses mopped the floors, housemaids went in their droves to improvise preparatory classes, feminists spent all the time looking after children and working in hospitals, seamstresses took up the challenge. Many rushed to offer their services, sewing machines and all to sew overalls, while others stood at the barricades handing out sandwiches and drinks to the squads of militiamen leaving in lorries to reconquer the villages. An example of how the Civil War changed but did not subvert gender roles in Spanish society was the way in which both sides used the image of the caregiving mother, who eventually became the heroine of the rear guard. Women who undertook supportive roles, providing social, family, and health care. Mothers who were willing to look after others and to sacrifice their children to the struggle, deploying a rhetoric that, although it modernized traditional values of motherhood, also spoke of the historical experience of many women during war devoted to sustaining themselves and their families. For women in the rearguard, the difficult wartime years meant three things. First, a reorganization of domestic work under a war economy that included rationing, resulting in long queues in all weathers to obtain food. Second, collaboration in unpaid work to maintain the services. And third, as the men were mobilized, access to jobs in clothing, health, war industries, and public transport, generally in subordinate, lower-paid posts, which nevertheless wrought a substantial change in the lives of many Spanish people. This gender equality ushered in and accelerated by the war was crushed with the rebel victory and the return of women to the private sphere. As part of this reversal, women were subjected to a repression for which the Ventas prison in Madrid was the flagship. Founded in 1933 during a reform spearheaded by the first female Director General of Prisons in the history of Spain, Victoria Kent, the new prison was intended as a model for the rest of Spain, but rapidly became a vast repository of inmates during the worst years of Franco's repression. Living under appalling conditions of overcrowding, scant and repugnant food, no hygiene and contagious diseases, the women incarcerated there at the end of the war who managed to get out alive and healthy could consider themselves fortunate. Many women were imprisoned for their active political participation in the conflict, but numerous others were jailed for being the mothers, wives, sisters or daughters of opponents to the Franco regime, in an attempt to blackmail and punish these latter. Other prisoners had been arbitrarily detained for insulting fascists or right-wing neighbours, for shouting at the bombing planes, for having been left-wing, for voting for the Popular Front, for accumulating enemy paper money, for having washed clothes for the militias, or for matters of a purely moral or behavioural nature. All were victims of a campaign of denunciation spurred by the victors, who imprisoned the women without any prior process, and then later questioned the neighbours about their ideas and behaviour. In such a repressive environment, anything could constitute a reason for imprisonment, and some groups of women from Madrid were particularly affected, such as caretakers. These generally older women were accused of betraying neighbours and of managing buildings to house refugees, and were considered suspicious by the Franco regime. Women who worked in the service sector, such as nurses, waitresses or housemaids, also fell under suspicion and were packed into the overcrowded prison, as Josefina Amalia Villa recounts. In 1939, there were 11 or 12 women in each cell, which would be completely bare with no more than the mattresses of beds of each. Every vestige of the former purpose of the prison had disappeared. It had become a gigantic container, a warehouse of women. The modern building held women cooped up in the corridors, the showers, the stairs, and even the toilets. They ate in shifts that went on until dawn. Children were herded together with those sentenced to death, and elderly women and prisoners with newborn children lived among disease with no medical assistance. Until 1944, the prisoners had no access to a gynecologist. Among others, this prison held the 70 women who were executed by firing squad in the nearby Eastern Cemetery in the first 2 years following the Franco victory, victims of the most brutal episode of repression of heroic Madrid. From Ventas, the prisoners could hear the shots being fired by the firing squad, counting the number who had been executed, as these would have been moved to a special section of the prison to prevent unrest when seeking them out from among the other prisoners. On August the 5th, 1939, prisoners at Ventas heard 56 shots, 13 of which targeted women, the famous 13 roses, of whom 7 had not yet reached the age of majority. These young women were linked to the United Socialist Youth, which they had allegedly attempted to regroup after the end of the war. Based on wild accusations and personal denunciations, the young women were placed on trial in a court of war and sentenced to death in the face of international protests. The fortitude with which they bore their death became a legend that Ventas prisoners told each other to keep their spirits up during the dark days of the repression.